It is a world-class monument, the tallest in the United States. Rising from the bank of the Mississippi River, a stainless steel arch proclaims the city of St. Louis gateway to the West. At 630 feet, its size alone would make it impressive, but it is equally remarkable in its simplicity. There are no statues here of pioneers or Indians, treaty signings or battles. It leaves us to imagine those who passed here on their way to changing a continent. Monuments remind us of that which has come and gone. The best of them offer not just memories, but inspiration. An arch is a passage. An arch that reflects the moods of the sun and the moon, the weather and our point of view, is a monument that invites us to dream. This land owes much to its rivers. A vast network of waterways connects the heart of North America to its farthest corners. Over 1,000 years ago, the Mississippian people built a great city just a few miles east of what is today St. Louis, trading throughout the continent by way of the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Illinois, Arkansas, and their tributaries. We know these people today from their monuments, giant earthen mounds. French traders began building a village on the bluffs above the western banks of the Mississippi in 1764, naming it after Louis IX, a crusader, a king, and a saint. Their neighbors, the Osage, understood why they had come.
When Western man came into this area, they turned the city into another trading empire, using the river systems, using the waterways, the strategic positioning between east and west. It didn't come as any surprise to the indigenous cultures that St. Louis became later a gateway.
St. Louis grew rapidly from a village to a city to a major center of commerce and manufacturing. Through the years of the mid-19th century, its levee was jammed with steamboats, bringing people and products from the east. Along the narrow streets of colonial St. Louis grew factories and warehouses. In 1849, a fire on a steamboat spread to 23 other boats, setting the levee ablaze and destroying much of downtown. From the ashes, the city rebuilt itself in red brick and cast iron. When the Eads Bridge connected St. Louis to the east by rail in 1874, trains replaced steamboats, and the city's center of commerce moved west from the levee. The riverfront began to decline, and by the turn of the 20th century, its condition was hard to ignore.
It was decrepit, much of it was abandoned, it was old, it had no particular economic value. As a historian, I have to observe it had a lot of historic value, but certainly in terms of finding an economically productive use for all of that, there wasn't any. And so then the debate ensued about, so what do we do?
There was no shortage of plans. The earliest of them envisioned the riverfront as a revitalized economic center. A new generation of progressive city planners sought to bring order and beauty to the heart of the old town. Their visions of the future were bold and fantastic. In 1910, one artist imagined what downtown St. Louis might look like in the year 2010. This plan from 1915 includes an arch with the statue of St. Louis perched upon it. There would be transportation links and Beaux-Arts warehouses, statues, and a mall. But with little agreement and even less funding, decades of plans collected dust in the libraries of the city fathers. Arriving by train to St. Louis in 1933, civic leader Luther Ely Smith was struck by the ugliness of the landing. He proposed a grand monument to westward expansion and Thomas Jefferson, and worked tirelessly to raise support for the project. While debate ensued about what kind of monument it should be and who should pay for it, the Roosevelt administration approved the concept of a national memorial and purchased 75 acres along the riverfront. Between 1939 and 1942, 40 square blocks of old buildings were bulldozed. Some St. Louisans protested the destruction of the landing, accusing the city of turning its back on its own past. Most, though, adopted the view of generations before them, that this was a place where the future had always buried the past. Now there would be a new layer. The only question was, what would it be?
The monument must reflect the courage of the explorers. It must pay tribute to the sacrifices made by the soldiers. It must express the excitement of those early days during the rush for gold. The monument must contain the spirit of all the men and women who ventured into the wild unknown, thus making the Western pioneers a permanent part of our American heritage.
This corporate film from the mid-60s expresses the popular appeal at the time of a monument to the taming of the Wild West. Today, it's hard to imagine anything other than Eero Saarinen's plan. But a stainless steel arch was hardly a foregone conclusion.
I don't know how you'd build a monument to westward expansion. I mean, what would that look like? Especially if you're going to make it an abstraction, as opposed to a big sculpture of a Conestoga wagon or some other, or a huge steamboat that you haul out of the river and, you know, plasticize and put up on the park overlooking the river. I mean, those are the kinds of realistic depictions of the West. So the question is, you know, how do you, what's a symbol of westward expansion?
Once again, designs for the city's riverfront were set to paper. In 1947, the Jefferson National Expansion Association sponsored a nationwide competition that would finally put the matter to rest. 172 plans arrived in St. Louis, and as they were unwrapped and assigned numbers for the sake of anonymity, it became clear that the greatest architects and designers in America were taking this opportunity to present their visions of how post-war America might look. The proposals featured grand malls stretching west from the river. There were plazas and whimsical structures with unusual shapes. Some of the plans were playful, others somber. At least one offered you a place to park your helicopter. It was Eero Saarinen's arch, though, that presented its vision most completely, most elegantly, and most articulately. The roots of Saarinen's arch reach back to his boyhood in the creatively charged environment of Cranbrook Art Academy outside of Detroit. In the early 30s, newspaper publisher George Booth and his wife Ellen Scripps Booth invited Finnish architect Elil Saarinen to be the Art Academy's first president and design its campus. Elil's son Eero grew up there, at home in a world of design and art. Cranbrook's campus attracted many of the greatest creative minds of the mid-20th century, including sculptor Carl Milles, whose statues and fountains would later leave their own mark on St. Louis. The philosophy of Cranbrook made a deep impression on young Eero.
The integration of the arts, total integration of the arts, was critical to Cranbrook. That meant the integration of architecture, horticulture, the fine arts, painting, sculpture, as well as the decorative arts. They wanted to create an institution that would always provide training opportunities for artists dealing with contemporary art. Modern furniture, modern architecture, modern appliances, and mid-century modernism largely grew out of the work done at the Cranbrook Academy of Arts in the 1930s.
So the notion of a design that was both sculpture and architecture came naturally to Eero, who was determined to design a monument that could take its place among the great monuments of the world.
He wanted it to sort of exude permanence. So he looked at what makes a memorial great. You know, well, if you look at the Washington Monument, you've got an obelisk. So it's like the ancient Egyptians. If you look at the Jefferson Memorial, it's like a globe, it's a sphere. If you look at the Lincoln Memorial, it's a big cube. And so he started to think about an abstracted dome, and maybe that could be a tripod, an open tripod.
And he rendered this in pipe cleaners. And he decided this was too ungainly, so he removed one, coming up essentially with an arched form like this. At first, Arrow came up with a quadrilateral section. In other words, if you were to cut the arch at any one point, rather than a triangle, which we have now, there was a quadrilateral section. So the inside rim would have been flat, just like the outside. And he took this idea to Carl Millis here at Cranbrook, and Millis was the one who said, no, Arrow, you've got to make it more sculptural. The triangle is the only form you can have to make this work well.
Saarinen and his team kept reworking the concept. They briefly considered and rejected building it out of concrete or having it span the river. They made it taller and redesigned the shape. Early plans show the arch more as a parabola. Over time, it evolved into a catenary curve, the more graceful shape a chain assumes when held between 2 points. The judges made their decision in February of 1948, but mistakenly sent their congratulations to the more famous Saarinen, Iliel, who had submitted his own design. Father and son broke out the champagne. When, a few days later, the embarrassed panel announced that it was in fact the younger Saarinen who had won, they popped a second cork and toasted Eero and his gateway to the West. In 1961, Eero Saarinen died at the age of 51. His arch unbuilt, his vision intact. Among other things, the arch is the largest piece of minimalist art in the world. Minimalism is bare bones art, claiming to be no more than what it appears to be. Simple in design, devoid of a message from the artist, its impact relies upon the viewer completing the experience and providing the meaning.
For me, the arch is an absolutely beautiful example of public sculpture and public art on the grandest possible scale. And I find it to be, especially when I go down there at night, I find it to be sensuous, I find it to be ever-changing depending on the moon and the phases of the moon and the quality of light. It's spectacular.
And the shape of it changes. When we move throughout our city, sometimes we see it as an obelisk, when we see it on edge, and then we see it open up. It's almost like a hibiscus flower in the morning, which is closed and then opens up to reveal the beauty of what's inside.
And when you see it from any distance, you don't perceive it as a series of panels. You perceive it as one long strip. So you know it's a big thing, but you can't quite tell how big it is. And then when you actually go to it and stand at the foot of it and see the immensity of these stainless steel panels and look up and get a sense of how many of those there are and how your body measures against that, you start to have a sense of very specific kind of scale. And I've always thought that that was one of the really interesting things about it, that it worked at a human scale when you were near it, and it worked at a very monumental scale when you were away from it.
Big is not always better, but sometimes big can be pretty great. The arch would not work if it were just, 20 feet high. I mean, the charm of the arch is that it's just this huge opening where there actually is no opening. I mean, it's flat land all around. It creates an opening, and the idea that you go from one state to another, from one state of being to another.
It is anchored in the ground, but there's a lightness that seems to transcend weight. So it seems often suspended above us as it soars away from us visually.
So it's a point of arrival, it's a point of departure, it's a point of security. And I think that's such an interesting idea when you start thinking about the commemorative aspect of the arch, in that it commemorates activity, it commemorates movement, it commemorates the purchase itself. It has many, many intentional kinds of meanings.
But the fact is that the arch turned out to be so beautiful and such a perfect piece of architecture, and it literally is architectural perfection. It turned out to be so perfect that it exists for itself now. It doesn't celebrate anything, it celebrates itself.
It's one of those leaps of human creativity where all of a sudden somebody imagines a shape that is absolutely in itself, for inexplicable reasons, inherently attractive to people. Saarinen really created transcendent beauty. And transcendence to me is a quality that draws you out of the world that you typically inhabit. It's what you feel on a starry night looking up at a million stars, or it's what you feel when you are on top of a mountain. Arch does that. It draws people out of their daily lives and for a moment takes them somewhere else that's much more sublime.
The men who built the arch used different words to describe it. In the early 60s, they were young men, pouring concrete and shaping iron and steel hundreds of feet above the earth. Today, their memories are still clear and their perspectives unique.
I often think of the guys that built the arch in the same way I think that, maybe Stephen Ambrose looked at the World War II veterans that he interviewed, you know. I mean, they're real modest guys that, you know, we were just doing our job kind of thing. And yet they did an extraordinary thing. You know, they may downplay it and say, well, I worked on, 20 bridges and 15 high steel buildings and, they go on and on. But then they pull out a scrapbook about the arch. They don't have a scrapbook on any of the other projects they worked on. Here's a scrapbook about the arch.
The arch is known as a phenomena. It's one of the great engineering feats, but when you compare it with things like the Panama Canal, going to the moon, it's really not that big a deal. We did what someone asked us to do, what we were supposed to do. We did our job.
Well, there were some real characters, I'll say that down there. I guess it took a special type, maybe, I don't know. It was like being in a fun house. If you was in there at that particular time, they had just a wire running down the ceiling, and about every 10 feet they just had a bare light bulb hanging on it, with about that much tail. And as the derrick would swing over the side, well, it would move and those lights would dance. Well, it would cast shadows all over. Nothing was level. The only place was level is if you stood on a step or a platform, but everything else was out of whack around you. You couldn't see the ground, so you didn't know where your orientation was screwed up.
Depending upon the time of the year, it would create an atmosphere in there where there would be fog. And you would have, from the top, like in the summertime, from the top to the bottom, you could have as much as 30 degrees difference in temperature. It would create an atmosphere in there where there would be fog.
In the wintertime, the big thing, the arch actually worked like a big flue or a chimney. The air would rush up the inside at a fast rate. And they had a big bulkhead down in the bottom with a big door that you could open and go in, but when somebody opened the door at the bottom, that air would rush up through the arch and out the top, before it was connected. And that was cold in the wintertime.
Memories are the best souvenirs you can have, and that's what we have.
And can't never forget that. It's something in my lifetime, and I don't care how old I'm going to get, but I will never forget it.
Well, I know my kids and grandkids say, "Oh, Daddy built that." It's a feat. You look back at it, it's a heck of a job.
It'll be here long after I'm gone. I've worked on bridges, buildings, towers. Just if it's ironwork I've worked on. That arch is something you can back off and look at it and be proud of.
Yeah, not many people can build a national monument, I guess. Not that many of them.
But it is more than a memorial gateway. It springs aloft because it tells us of our future as well as our past. It soars because hope soars. This tallest structure in America is an act of faith, of belief in the majesty of our future.
The majesty of our future, preserved in the grooves of a 1960s record album. But if the optimism sounds forced, it's because St. Louis in 1965 was really more of a gateway to the suburbs. St. Louis was hurting and welcomed a symbol that would give it a new identity.
It's not the first symbol that our cities had. The city's symbols in the earlier years were the Eads Bridge. The other is St. Louis the King, the Crusader King, most sort of represented by the statue up in front of the Art Museum. So those symbols haven't completely gone away, they're still sort of there, but they have, for the most part, been eclipsed by the arch. I think that's because it is so amazing, so out of the ordinary, so different from a typical urban landscape. I don't see how it could not have become the preeminent symbol for this community.
But what kind of symbol? And what does Gateway to the West mean?
In some ways, the arch represented that period of time when people passed through St. Louis to explore the West. But if you're an indigenous culture that lived here for 1,000 years and completely untouched by these modern Western elements of society, the arch doesn't represent anything but a benchmark of a period of time when your culture went away. From an American Indian standpoint, it's hard to see any good from that reminder.
St. Louis is also a gateway between the North and South. In the mid-60s, the city offered limited job opportunities for African Americans, and to many St. Louisans, the arch is a reminder of the struggle to achieve racial equality. On July 14, 1964, Percy Green turned the arch into a symbol for the civil rights movement when he and Richard Daley, a white colleague, climbed the north leg of the arch and occupied it at the 125-foot level for 6 hours. After climbing back down, they passively resisted arrest and were carried to a police van.
We thought that this was an opportune time to further educate the community that racism was still alive and well, and here is a good example of such. The arch being erected with federal funds, and no blacks are working, neither are there any blacks that had received contracts.
And so the arch joined lunch counters, buses, and schools as a place where racial inequality would not be tolerated. As the legs of the arch rose gradually above the St. Louis skyline, there was grumbling. Skeptics joked that it wouldn't meet in the middle. The giant croquet wicket, some called it. Critics opined that the money would be better spent on the city's social and economic problems. Cities, like people, can develop peculiarities, mild neuroses. St. Louis is still coping with Chicago snatching its role as Queen of the Midwest. That happened in the 1870s. Many St. Louisans still speak of the 1904 World's Fair as the city's last really great party. It's tough being a second-tier city when there are so many reminders of past glory.
St. Louis is the only city that has a world-class monument to the people who had the gumption to leave. Originally, everyone was on the East Coast, and the successful people tended to stay on the East Coast, and the unsuccessful people started moving west. And the ambitious unsuccessful people kept moving. The less ambitious unsuccessful people got to St. Louis and said, this is far enough, this is it. It's a quirky monument, a world-class quirky monument.
And yet 3 million visitors a year come to be photographed beside it, ride to the top of it, or simply reach out and touch it.
I was born in Hawaii on October 28, 1965. I came in here in 1988 and I saw the video on the construction, and I remember when they said the centerpiece was put in on October 28, 1965, I sat there and went, wow. I'm connected with a national monument, and I couldn't think of a better monument. The symbol of the arch is very meaningful to me. It's like I said, it's the gateway to the future. It's the gateway to my future. All I have to do is pass through it.
Hi, I'm Becky Queen of Carpet. Don't fall for the other discount carpet stores at
The old symbols made way for the new. Its simple shape quickly became an emblem instilling regional pride and confidence, permanence, and the sign of a good place to spend your money. The first logo incorporating the arch was probably designed in the late 40s by photographer Robert Artiga, who with his sons Eldon and Wayne documented the construction of the arch for the federal government.
So it says Artiga photos inside, and he put the old cathedral on his logo with the old courthouse and ripples on it for the river. And when we put it on this building downtown on 3rd and Walnut when we were downtown, and people would actually stop by and look at it, and they said, what's that, you know, and they'd tell them about the arch.
To the world, the arch presents its best face. But daily life with a world-class monument offers St. Louisans another view. A view often blocked by wires, telephone poles, overpasses, smog, and billboards. Artist Alan Brunetine's work celebrates not the arch's beauty, but its relationship with the city.
I see it less a singular image than part of the whole urban fabric. So the thing I really try to bring out in the images I use is the city as a whole as it surrounds this central point of the arch.
Brunetine's video piece, Arch 360, shows us a city and a monument locked in a dance. A 1,000 years from now, there will likely be a river and an arch. There may be a city. If that city prospers, visitors then will regard this arch as a monument that prophesies a bright future. If in 1,000 years there are only remnants of a city here, they will still be impressed by its scale, its grace, and its moods. If years from now they know or care little about Thomas Jefferson or westward expansion, they may at least understand this arch as a monument to something we all share across time and history: the human imagination.